I still suspect that solar and wind are much more carbon intensive than we're being told because of the expense of building the damn things, of what goes into making batteries, which are really kind of hideous. Um, and we don't talk very much about the energy intensity of things. And so I've seen arguments on both sides of this that so energy intensity is the amount of, better than I do, but just for listeners' sake, it's the amount of energy you have to put into something to get energy out of it, right? And so the energy intensity of wind and solar is not all that impressive. The energy intensity of oil and gas is really impressive because there's just so much energy in the carbon molecules. Um, how does nuclear compare on the sort of energy intensity question? Or am I wrong? And also, am I wrong about the carbon intensity stuff about the wind and
Yeah.
solar?
So first, the wind and solar issue. There's a whole study in this field of a life cycle analysis. If you include the mining, the shipping, the refining, how much energy is involved in building a wind turbine compared to the amount of energy it produces over its lifetime. And I'm not 100% confident in any of those analyses, but they indicate, as you say, that once you analyze the full footprint, it's not as good as people think. There's another element to this. People often measure wind and solar in terms of how efficient they are when they're operating, but they're only in a lot of the country, solar panels are only producing a decent amount of power about 20% of the time. Wind turbines are maybe 30% of the time, depending on where they are. If the wind blows too hard, you have to turn them off. If it doesn't blow hard enough, they don't work. And so if you think about it, you imagine you built a car and somebody said, I've got this amazing power source. When it's working, it's going to give you virtually free power. And you say, okay, great. But it only works part of the time. So I've got this other power source, this wind power source that gives you almost free power when it's working, but it doesn't work all the time. And I can't tell you when it's going to work. So you're going to need a gas motor too. You're going to need three different energy sources, and half the time you're going to have too much power, and then sometimes you're only going to have your gas engine. So each one of these things has to be, in a sense, overbuilt. And you can imagine how expensive a car would be, if it ran like that. That's kind of what we're doing with our power grid. It's an oversimplification, but you've got solar that comes on and produces a ton of power for a little while, then turns off very quickly when the sun goes down. You've got wind that comes and goes unpredictably. It always seems to not be there when you need it most, like during that cold snap in Texas in 2021, when there was all the different power systems were struggling, and they have a lot of wind in Texas, but it just happened not to be blowing during that week of that cold snap. So you have to overbuild all this stuff. So you can't just say how much energy goes into building those solar panels. You have to say we're going to have to build 2 or 3 times more stuff to run our power grid mostly on wind and solar, precisely because they don't operate all the time. You're going to need to build more power lines. If it's sunny in Arizona but cloudy in Ohio, and you want to move power all the way from Arizona to Ohio, you're going to need a massive investment in power lines. So all of those sources are not as efficient as they could be. And not to say they don't have a role or they don't work well when they work, but managing them is hard. Contrast that with a nuclear plant. You turn it on and it runs for a couple of years at a time between refuelings. The refuelings are very predictable. You shut the plant down for a few weeks, you refuel it, you turn it back on, and it does this. There's this question of the energy that goes into building it, but there's also the energy, the energy density of the fuel itself, and it's orders and orders of magnitude. If you powered your life entirely with nuclear power, all your electricity with nuclear power in your lifetime, the spent fuel from that process would roughly fill a Coke can. If you powered your life, if you tried to run your life on wind and solar, you need hundreds of acres of, solar panels and turbines. If it was coal, you would need hundreds of train cars of coal, in your lifetime, and a huge amount of waste and stuff left over in the end. So the energy density of nuclear is a huge, huge advantage, and it's an issue that's often, I think, a lot of times the renewable fans, the serious ones are serious about it, but I think a lot of people just assume that we're going to build a lot of wind and solar panels, and they don't appreciate how little power they actually put out on an acre by acre basis.
Yeah, I mean again, that's it seems to me because I remember getting to these arguments about the amount of subsidies that go into oil and gas versus go into whatever, go into wind and solar, and the environmentalists would all say, look at it, look at the amount of money that goes into oil and gas, and that's a perfectly fair point about why you would subsidize an industry that's profitable, and you can have legitimate, arguments about that. But what they would never look at is that per unit of energy produced, the chart goes completely inverted, right? And so, yeah, in absolute terms, oil and gas was getting more money, but then you look and wind and solar was getting very little. But then if you look at like how much each unit of energy costs, it was pennies on the dollar, if that, from the subsidies for oil and gas compared to the amount of subsidies you give for wind and solar. And it seems like I mean, I I don't like I don't aesthetically I don't like either. I really don't. I'm a big cross country driver. I think the windmills are kind of hideous. I like charismatic megafauna like birds of prey and raptors and all that kind of stuff, and it kills a lot of them. There's this whale stuff, but it feels like it's a vanity project in many of the instances that it's in. Where do you think, other than supremely windy places, um, or personal solar panels on homes, where are the best arguments on a pure efficiency basis for the big wind and solar stuff to your light by your
Yeah.
lights?
Well, the best argument, the best locations, as you say, West Texas, the Western Plains, where the winds blow steady. What's interesting about those places is they have low populations. So once you commit to wind, you're basically saying, let's build our power generation about as far from the population centers as possible, and then let's build thousands and thousands of miles of transmission lines to move that power much farther than we typically do. This is the heart of one of the reasons that the Biden administration has passed both the infrastructure bill and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, is to fund stuff like those power lines. I'm dubious those lines are going to get built. We seem to have trouble building much of any major infrastructure these days due to all the delays and problems with permitting. Senator Manchin tried to come up with a solution to these permitting delays. It didn't really fly, but this is a major issue we're going to have to confront. But I say, okay, instead of trying to build, I mean, even if those wind turbines, again, they can produce really cheap energy when they're working. But how about taking some of these coal plants we've been shutting down that are located close to where the power is needed? They're already hooked up to the power grid. Well, how about putting some of these small modular reactors there, where they would, you put 4 or 8 little reactors in one of these coal plants, or someplace where nuclear plants have retired, like on the Hudson Valley where I live. And it's not just plug and play, but it's pretty close to that, compared to saying, like, we're going to build a giant wind farm and then build thousands of miles of power lines to move the power around. And by the way, those are going to turn on and off unpredictably. So you're going to have to build a whole different power system as a backup for when the wind's not blowing. That doesn't seem like the easiest or most sensible approach to me.